Do you want to close the back door perhaps because of outside noise?
All set?
Yeah.
All right, everybody ready? As ready as we're going to be? No pressure. The entire senior class is going to watch this, so don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. They're probably not going to watch it.
Well, they're like Ian. They're going to open it, but
You're right. Yeah, they're going to let it run in the background
Now I read it.
on their phone while they're on their computer. Yeah. All right. Welcome, YouTube and everyone at EF Academy, to our 5th TOK talk. Tonight we are discussing PT number 5 for the 2022 IB grading period, which reads as follows. How can we distinguish between good and bad interpretations discussed with reference to the arts and one other area of knowledge? Let me introduce the panel briefly. We have Ms. Wegbright on our far right, who is an English teacher here at EF Academy. We have Keaton, an IB senior, Ian, another IB senior, Mr. Miller, a TOK teacher and administrator, and Roseanne, another IB senior. And I am Andrew Lesnoda, and I'll be our moderator for tonight. Hopefully I won't be talking too much. So without any further ado, I'd like to just kind of jump right into it. I think that it's important to note that the question presupposes that there are such things as good and bad interpretations. I think one of the obvious kind of knee-jerk reactions to answer this question is to say, there's no such thing as a good and bad interpretation when it comes to the arts. But the question says, how can we distinguish between them? Which again assumes that they exist. So we have to go into the question assuming that that is the case. However, I wonder what you guys think about a couple of these questions along those lines. Does this imply that there must be an objective difference between good and bad interpretations, or can that difference be subjectively chosen? Can these differences exist while remaining subjective? Anyone who wants to jump in on that, or if you just want to talk about your thoughts on the question in general, that's fine too.
Can I say something?
Please.
Maybe, in my opinion, I think a good interpretation would be an accurate interpretation of the subject that we're discussing about or being focused on. Like, for example, how accurate somebody interpret this mask. Like, for example, oh, this mask is white. Then that's a good interpretation, isn't it? Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, so like a good interpretation is trying to not be as biased as possible, like when trying to judge something. And then, like Rosen said with the mask, like you have an interpretation which is like is accurate, but also a bad interpretation is something that for me could be seen as good, but for someone else could just be bad. So it depends on how everyone perceives it, not that there's specifically like a bad or good interpretation.
I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused. So a good interpretation must be something objective and accurate, and a bad interpretation would be something subjective?
Like
and
not entirely, like not entirely accurate. Accurate, but like not as accurate, because like everything is judged differently, or like.
Well, how do you determine accuracy without reference to something objective? Like the two of you have used the word accurate, right? Well, to me, accurate is kind of this idea of aligning, right? And so your perspective would be aligning with what, if it's not something objective you're measuring against?
Yeah, so to Roseanne's example, the mask being white, the objective would be kind of our visualization of color. But to Keaton's point, if we say that art, for instance, being so subjective, it's hard to say what we're trying to aim at in terms of that accuracy. So the example of the mask may not fit into the arts, which I think is the winky way that the IB has made us think about this subjectivity question.
I think too, it's important to think about what type of interpretation you actually are going for. Are you going for a literal interpretation, or are you going for a more abstract one? I think that as an English teacher, I constantly tell students you can interpret a text however you want, as long as you have textual evidence to support your interpretation, to support your thinking about a text. Then why can't it be correct, right?
Well, there's your qualifier right there.
Yeah.
like your answer to the question, right? As long as you have textual
evidence.
reference,
Yeah.
would be one way that you as a teacher would be determining.
Whether it's a good or bad. Yeah, absolutely.
When I look at this question, I think it's a landmine of a sentence. Of all the TOK prompts this year, this one is the one that is loaded with loaded words, right? More so than anything, I think. And I think Mr. Lee's note was absolutely dead on, where I think a lot of students are gonna go down a fruitless path where they equate interpretation with perspective. And they just go, well, anyone's perspective, it's all subjective, and it can mean anything. And it's, I think that's not the path that IB wants you to walk here. I think they want you to be able to say, well, in art, let's go into an area of knowledge. Like, there are art critics, and there are some art critics who will say this art is better than that art, and there are people who will pay a lot of money to those art critics, for example, to do that. Or there's good music and bad music, or there's an art teacher who says this is a good piece that you've produced, or this is not as good quality. And what are those measurements they're using to make those determinations, I think is really the question that we're trying to get at here, right?
But then also too, don't we need to know what their qualifications are in order to make those assumptions as well? And in IB language and literature, we talk about what is the difference between literature, right? The like very pretentious version versus like an airplane read, right? Why are there different categories of the art in the first place? Who decides that?
Yeah.
And do they actually have the credentials to decide that? I think is important to know.
And I think before we began, Ian and I pre-gamed a little bit and talked about the difference between kind of whether it's a good or bad interpretation or a good or bad piece of artwork. Because you can have a really bad piece of artwork, and as long as your interpretation is basically like, I interpret this as bad,
Right.
then it's still a good interpretation.
And that gets back to Roseanne's point about it has to be accurate to something. And I think that something is the thing that a student in writing this essay needs to answer for the art. Like, by what are you measuring it against?
But I think it's also about like the approval of like people. Like, for example, if a majority of people think that it is good, and when you say it's good, and people, you will think that it was accurate because the majority of people will think it's accurate. It means like, I'm saying like the approval of people matters, and also even like people with higher power. Like, for example, a king or a president says like, oh, this is a good art, and like many people will believe him because he's like having a high social status. So like, you know, approval maybe matters in this case.
I think like an example for what Rosen said, it would be Van Gogh maybe, that when he was lived, most people didn't believe his art was good, and maybe the general opinion made it look bad, but nowadays we can see the technique, which can be considered one of the ways of evaluating if it's good or bad, and nowadays it's considered really good art. So
And that's a good real life situation for the TOK people that are watching.
I think it's an important distinction that Roseanne brings up too, and one that you don't necessarily need to fall on one side or the other, but it's worth talking about is how do we determine whether something is a good interpretation? Do we default to experts who have these kind of objective criteria that they use? Do we default to consensus where most people agree, therefore it's the truth? Or do we fall somewhere in between those, depending on what we're talking about?
Well, this I think comes back to what I was saying about this is a loaded sentence full of loaded words. Like, everything, like, good and bad, to me, has like often an ethical side to it. I mean, that's what good means. They didn't say right and wrong interpretations. They said good and bad, which I think actually, we know it's not a philosophy course per se, but that would be an important distinction in a philosophy course. Like, those words matter. So this ethical dimension, I think, is an interesting approach that a student can take to this. But additionally, because ethics are so highly contextualized, so are interpretations. You interpret things in different contexts for different reasons. And so in any analysis of this question, I think the student almost needs to start with the real life situation to set the context for within which the interpretation is happening, and then be able to measure based on that whether it's a good or a bad interpretation. So I think an example might be contrasting something you do as a student for art class and a teacher saying this is, you know, a good or bad product versus maybe something more political or something more that gets us more into the realm of ethics, and we could say this is good or bad for other reasons, that maybe it does damage in some way or something. I think exploring it from those different contexts is going to be the way that you can, at least in the arts, look at good and bad in these different lights.
Yeah, I think another question that you kind of touched on there is these different ways in which we can look at good and bad. So I think the ethical frame is definitely a good one for students to use. Another one that I thought of earlier was kind of the utility of the interpretation. Does the interpretation help us to understand the artwork? Does it hinder our understanding of the artwork? Does it serve some other purpose? Is that a way to decide whether it's a good interpretation or a bad interpretation? So for example, an interpretation that doesn't add anything or help us to understand or say anything new might be a bad interpretation just because of its lack of utility. Sorry, I started that as a question and ended up being more of a statement.
But I don't know how, we want to stay in arts for a while too, but I think that's a good door to open to start looking at other AOKs as well. Because I think as I start to think about this more and we're talking, to me, I almost think that the contextualization is so important in the arts as an area of knowledge. And I think maybe one of the contrasts to another AOK might be that maybe context becomes less important in terms of how you determine accuracy in science, right? That's one of the things they say about science is true whether you want to believe it or not, or math or something like that. That might be a word that students like to use a lot, like more objective or more quote unquote unbiased, but this idea that accuracy is determined differently, almost independent of context in some areas of knowledge, where it is super context dependent in something like arts.
I think too about monetary value. Like if something is given a monetary value, then does that make it, I don't know, more valuable or more useful in terms of the way that something is given? Like I don't know, the thing that came to my mind was the banana with like a piece of duct tape on it, right? Like, or like any Bitcoin. I don't really understand that at all. But yeah, or NFT, right? Like they are given a monetary value, and based on that monetary value, it's whether or not that piece of art or that meme or whatever it is, right, is good or bad.
I think in this case it's based on demand, because like, for example, for the banana thing and some other silly stuff, maybe they're like memeable, so they're like manipulating the people that they are, oh, we should buy these because it's like trending, people want this, so they will also think that, oh, I also want this, But like for other stuff like, I don't know, arts, like for example, artwork that has higher value, sometimes like arts get auctioned, right? And in the auctions, people bid money, and the higher, the more demand it has, it means the higher the price it gets, and it also goes back to my previous point, which is the approval of people towards what.
Yeah, I think to give an example of what you were saying for both points, Rozan, I'm a big fan of the band Rush. I don't know if you guys know, they're a prog rock band. They were eligible to go into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for like, I think 19 years before they were inducted, and they have some of the most dedicated fans. They're very, very popular, have sold millions of records, and yet Rolling Stone magazine, who runs the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, wasn't impressed with Rush for a long time, so they didn't get in. But eventually they did, so there's like a good contrast here. There's a great deal of consensus that this is a good band, that we interpret their art as being good, and yet there was one kind of authority that said, no, we don't actually interpret it that way.
And I would assume, subjectively, the fans would say, if they were asked, was that a bad interpretation by Rolling Stone?
Yes, it was.
Right. So, yeah, and based on what? And partially, I think, if not entirely, the consensus of the fans who follow them, compared to other bands that have fans less loyal and less of a following.
I'm not going to go on, but I could. Going back to your point a little bit earlier, Mr. Miller, I think one of the big questions I think that many people who pick this PT should grapple with is how difficult it is to distinguish between good and bad interpretations depending on the area of knowledge you're talking about. My interpretation, pun intended, is that the IB made you talk about the arts because they consider that to be the most difficult to distinguish between good and bad interpretations. Whereas something like natural science or perhaps math might be a little bit easier to determine whether that interpretation is good or bad. So I was wondering what you guys thought about comparing those areas of knowledge.
Okay, so like in the arts, like with movies, like the interpretations are based on like how good the movie was. If there was like a prequel to a movie, like in a series, was it as good? Was it like, did it reduce in quality, or was it not as effective? That's what like people use to judge sequels. But like prequels, like main movies, you judge them based on how accurate they were, if like they were effective. So I think that the good or bad interpretation is based on those criteria, and then in other like areas of knowledge is similar, but then because art is more about perception, how you like interpret something, I think it's different in that.
I think for movies, it's also about like how well the movie can stand out compared to other movies. So the fact that, for example, I mean, superhero is like kind of common these days, but like in the early time when there was like no such thing as superhero, the first appearance of like superhero comics or movies, is something new to the people, and if they like it, and it will be something like big, you know, like it's just like some other, in other areas like business, for example, the first electric car, like, I mean, think how innovative that electric cars are.
I think that like when looking at art comparing to other AOKs, art there is like a lot of the factor of the technique, I would say, comparing to other subjects. I wouldn't say maybe natural science would, for example, there is like a lot of technique when we are putting our interpretations towards it. So, and also the subject that is talking about, I know like, for example, Rosen gave the example of superhero movies. I'm not sure which director just said recently, but for him superhero movies are not like actual movies. So how can we put like the interpretation of good or bad for the fans is something that they might think it's fun or represent them, and for the other, like there's more of the technical quality of how a story or how a movie should work. So
I don't know if this is the person you're thinking of, but Martin Scorsese said something very similar.
Yeah, I think it's
a well-known director, and and I was actually thinking of that myself as you're saying that. It's like when you mentioned superhero movies, like the idea that like there are Oscar-worthy movies and or Oscar bait movies versus and not, and like so like this weekend or last weekend, Will Smith had a new movie that came out in November, another movie about a drama about a father, a real life story, and it's it's Oscar bait. Will Smith wants his Oscar, and this doesn't say anything about the quality of the movie, but that movie is positioned to be considered higher, at least in terms of like a lot of traditional critics, versus like Black Widow that came out a few months earlier, and so on. So the monetary thing isn't necessarily even always the right one, because I bet Black Widow made a lot more than King Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, it's like, to me, especially with the arts, art is supposed to make you feel something, right? Whereas in other areas of knowledge, how much does feeling actually go into kind of your interpretations and your even analysis or knowledge of that? And so to me, when it comes to, the hierarchy, the Oscar baits, the, critically acclaimed versus, not, right?
The schlock or the mainstream.
What you watch again on an airplane, right? Or versus the Criterion Collection, right? I think again we have to think about who is deciding this, who is choosing this. Are they all very upper middle class white men? What is the demographic there that helps to?
Sounds like that question was a statement.
Sorry, I'm in a room that is I think diversity is really important in distinguishing between good and bad, and I think that there are I don't know, I think that the arts is something that there's so many different criterion that come into play. whereas other areas of knowledge there just isn't as much.
Well, one thing too that Ian said that I think is worth bringing up as well, especially for students writing the essay, is that I think there's going to be another attractive thing for students as they write to be like, arts is entirely different from X A-OK, right? But I think it's worth looking at where they're similar in how you can determine good and bad as well. I think that'll be a nice counterclaim way of looking at it, or at least other perspective. And one thing Ian said was that and I think I disagree with, where he said like, in art it's often the technique of the way it is, the way the thing is produced that we use to determine it's good or bad. But I think that another word you could substitute for technique in that instance would be method. And every AOK does have a methodology that I think has, for your TOK essay, subject-specific vocabulary that would help you with your grade, but even more so, like getting into the methodology of how the knowledge is produced, and then finding those similarities of like, we determine if it's good or bad if you followed the proper method. And so when you write a science paper, a whole section in a journal is dedicated to your methodology, and in the peer review process, that is what people read. Like for me, when I use a paper in my research, I skip methodology and jump to conclusion because that's what I'm looking for, the data or whatever. I'm not really peer reviewing these things, but other peers of the author are, and that's what they're looking at, determine if this is worthy of being in the canon or in the science or whatever it might be.
I think for movies, it's also to like distinguish about the good and bad interpretations. It would also, one of the factors would be also the ability of the actors to play as the characters. I'm so sorry. Alright, so as I was saying, like I think it's also about the ability of the actors to act as the characters provided by the scriptwriters, directors.
All those things.
Yeah, all those people. So like I think there's also like for Oscars, that's one of the, like Mr. Miller said, like Oscar baits movies, like King Richard.
Yeah.
Like it also aims for like how good the actor can act as the characters, right? It's not just about like the plot of the movie.
Well, the Oscars themselves are interesting because there are different Oscars that are considered more important than others as well, right? Like the best actor and the best director and the best movie are always front and center, and then like it's like best VFX is like off screen, or they don't even get it the same night, It's like,
Yeah, as Rosan was making his point, I was thinking about Mad Max Fury Road, which is this movie where I love it. But if you measured it by its script or by its plot, you'd be like, this is clearly a bad film. But if you ignore that and you look at the effects and the cinematography, it's pretty brilliant. So it depends on kind of accuracy. Coming back to your original point, Rosan, like what kind of accuracy or technique or methodology are you measuring? Which one do you consider to be most important? Because I think you can have two good interpretations of Mad Max Fury Road. One could say it's a bad movie and one could say it's a good movie. And they would still be good interpretations because they're looking at it in very different ways.
True.
And I think too, like I've listened to podcasts or critics talk about movies, and they're like, well, I wouldn't recommend this to my kids or my parents, but I would recommend it to my professor of whatever. And so I think too, to me it goes back to purpose, right? What's the purpose of this interpretation? And I don't like the phrase good and bad interpretations. I still am just very against it. It's fine.
But to go back to it, and I think what we're saying is that one of the distinguishing parts of the arts is that you can have conflicting conclusions that are both good interpretations, as long as there's some sort of support for that, right?
Right.
So I think to the point, like a bad interpretation, like I know your class is reading Romeo and Juliet right now. A bad interpretation would be, write a review of Romeo and Juliet as an assignment, and the student writes, it sucked.
Right. Because there's
Blanket, right?
no evidence.
Right. Yeah. They could go. It was, maybe not sucked would be bad for the paper, but like it was not good, right? It was not good because, and here's a whole essay listing different things.
Right.
You have the same conclusion, but one is a good interpretation and one is not, based on the reasoning for the interpretation.
Right. Absolutely.
So a good interpretation would be one with criteria instead of only just showing your opinion.
I think it's like the justifications of your opinion.
Mhm.
too.
So I,
Do you need that in any other area of knowledge?
I think so.
Absolutely. History.
Okay.
Think about like
Okay.
writing history, and it's such a combination of the art of the storytelling
Mhm.
with the support of the evidence. Being otherwise, you're writing fiction, right?
Right.
Or aspirational history, perhaps. You know, if you're in the Soviet Union in the 70s. But yeah, like yeah, for sure.
And I guess that's the whole point of doing an experiment, right? In science, right? You have a hypothesis that you then need to prove, right? With the actual evidence for that interpretation.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't do science.
no, I think that's a very important point, because I think to jump in the panel for a second, history probably has a bit more in common with art than perhaps does natural science, in the sense that I think you can have two very different interpretations of a historical event using the same evidence and materials, but be basing them off of different kind of methodologies or ideologies. So you could have a Marxist interpretation or a gendered interpretation, come with very different conclusions about some kind of event, but they could both be valid because they're commenting on kind of slightly different things. Whereas in an experiment, I find it difficult to see what value a diverging interpretation could have, in that the experiment, in my opinion, again, is designed to narrow down variables to the point where you can only have one kind of logical, good interpretation.
Well, I think it depends, again, what you mean by good in that context,
Mhm.
right? Because I think, again, if we're talking good in terms of accuracy to some objective standard, then I think you're right, you know? But I think a good interpretation for a scientist could also be like in a more ethical way of like, okay, this experiment, I did it, and it was a failure. That was bad. I don't like that. Whereas the scientist right next to him doing the same experiment could be like, this experiment was a failure. I really learned what wasn't the truth here. I'm happy, and I'm interpreting, and that's my interpretation. It was a success in that sense. Success for me learning what wasn't true, apparently, right? And so the way that they interpret their own thing, I think, is also valid, but I think that gets into more of like an ethical question of what a good interpretation is versus a bad one, too.
And I think that's where the lines between AOKs become a little fuzzy. So for instance, talking about the experiment would clearly be natural science, whereas I might argue that my own kind of psychological interpretation of success might be
Sure.
human science, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. The other thing too about, you're gonna say about the history, not only can you have like an interpretation when you're writing the story, but you can have historians interpret the same source differently, right? Like a letter that someone wrote, and what did he mean by, henceforth or whatever, right? Like he meant go now. It's like, no, he meant that it's too late, and that can lead to entirely different writings, and their interpretation is still potentially valid if they can justify it textually through that letter or that source. But
Yeah, and then that gets into translation too,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I mean, how many versions of a text are there that by different translators? There's like Jhumpa Lahiri, she refuses to translate her own texts because she thinks that she'll modify the writing that she did in Italian when she converts it back to English. And so she hires a translator in order to translate her text so that it's truer to her original writing. And yeah, and so that's her book, In Other Words. It was phenomenal, and I highly recommend it. But yeah, it's so interesting to think about how she is almost claiming that she would misinterpret her own work that she wrote. Is that even possible? I don't know.
No, I wondered this too. To what extent is an interpretation a translation?
Mhm.
Are they synonyms or are they slightly different?
That's a good question.
An interpretation of something that was translated would be considered worse or a bad interpretation if the translation is not exactly like the original one was.
So I think using kind of Razan's original point of like the accuracy judgment, then yeah, I would agree with you. But I think you could also make the argument that you could improve something through translation. And that might be a good interpretation of the original because it holds on to the interiority or the meaning that was originally intended.
So like are we suggesting, this is a real question, are we suggesting that like all translations are a kind of Venn diagram and good ones are closer to a circle than bad ones? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Essentially, almost saying that translations are a form of interpretation, but interpretation does not have to be a translation, because I think there are so many different types of interpretations. Again, I think that is part of it. Also, too, translation is so that you can understand a work, right, in the language of your choice, right, or the language of your choosing. And so that gets into more of a linguistic competency rather than, and language proficiency than the analysis of something. And so is interpretation just for understanding, or is interpretation for analysis and evaluation? And the way that we had been talking about it before was more for analysis and evaluation. And to me, translation, you can't evaluate or analyze. It has to be the very literal,
I think
so
an
that someone else
example
can do
for
it.
like this case of translation would be like the Bible, because like
Religion is no longer an area of knowledge, though, so we can.
let's consider it. But like religion, like what do you call it? The Bible. What is the original language? It was
Several.
Sanskrit.
Sanskrit, right?
The Bible?
Wasn't
I
it?
don't know.
Aramaic,
Aramaic, Sanskrit.
some Greek, some
Yes.
Latin.
Yes, but like
Is it
now
several different
they're-
languages?
They're interpreted, like they're published in like many different languages. Like for example, in English, obviously, right? But like for example, back in my country, maybe I also see like Bibles translated in Indonesian, you know. So, but like I'm really sure that they have like really different meanings than the original ones. So I think that's a bad interpretation. But like comparing to the Quran, you know, like for Muslims,
Yeah.
the Quran mostly they're produced still in Arabic, because their origins are Arabic. But like even in my country, they're still produced in Arabic. So I think that's what improves the interpretation. So even though it's still in Arabic and it's like obviously harder for other people, international people, to understand, so they have to learn the language itself. So it has its pros and cons in translation.
But it would be considered a poor interpretation in the case like a change in the translation might change the meaning of something, but the interpretation on itself would be bad. You're just maybe interpreting different things, but would it consider like be poorly made just because of the translation differences?
And then I think it comes back to kind of the original question we were talking about, which is how do we judge which is good or bad? So for instance, if you take the Bible and say like any inaccurate translation of the Bible is a bad interpretation, or you could say that because this particular translation had this particular good moral or ethical effect on this country, then it was a good interpretation because of the good impact. It kind of breaks down into the kind of deontological versus consequentialism argument that we have in ethics all the time.
But are we assuming that a translation is an interpretation of something, or that translation is just a translation?
The original question I asked was how similar are the two, so I think you could answer either.
The thing with the Quran, though, too, that is sort of a thing that a lot of Muslims around the world will definitely say is one reason that they believe in their religion, or they believe their book, because it is less open to interpretation. Although there's a lot of questions around how original this current version actually really is. But that aside, it's probably nothing compared to the different versions of the Bible, for sure. There is one anecdote that I don't know how true it is, but I've heard it enough that it's worth at least bringing to the discussion of one of the mistranslations apparent or possible in the Quran is the word for virgin was very similar to this word for like a really rare white grape. And you having these white grapes would be, if you had them, you would be considered very, very rich at the time. And so there's an interpretation where possibly a bunch of people have been suicide bombers, and they're now going to go to heaven and get their 70 white grapes, and they'll be very disappointed. So I hope that happened to them. So misinterpretation, I guess, 'cause that would be a bad interpretation.
Again, it depends on
A bad translation.
your preferences, I suppose. I want to come back, at least for a minute, to this kind of how easy or difficult it is to determine whether an interpretation is good or bad based on the AOK. I feel like we mostly think that arts is probably the most difficult. Do we have one that we think is perhaps the easiest, or do we have ones that we think are similar? For instance, if we took natural science and human science, which of those two do you think it'd be easier to distinguish between good and bad interpretation?
Wait, I have a question. Is mathematics AOK?
I was going to go there next, but yes.
Yes.
I would say it would be mathematics or natural sciences. I think they both have more clear procedures, maybe to prove if something is right or wrong, a theory is approved or not approved. So the interpretation would be more clear, maybe because there are like established and more common sense criteria to improve something, rather than in arts, like we said, the Oscars may have one, a fan opinion might be different.
Yeah, I think math is the easiest, in my opinion.
I'd actually have the exact opposite opinion. I don't necessarily think that arts is the hardest. I think it's the easiest for that reason. That because it's like anyone's interpretation can be good as long as they justify it, right? Whereas with math, you don't really get interpretations of math until you get to very high level math. And at very high level math, apparently, there's a lot of discussion and debate about certain truths and certain theorems and certain proofs that I can't even begin to access because I don't have the background knowledge. So for me, determining a good and bad interpretation in math is quite difficult, whereas determining a good and bad interpretation in arts is about as easy as it gets.
What are the interpretations in math? Do you guys have any examples?
If Mr. Johnson were here, he could definitely throw out a bunch of them, but there are definitely, at high level mathematics, a lot of debate about whether certain proofs work or certain theorems are accurate and whatnot. It's not as simple as like, no one disagrees that 2 + 2 = 4, I don't think. But I do think that the more abstract math, there's a lot of uncertainty and debate. But I can't give you more than that because it's too difficult for me to do that.
But I think I might have, I'm not sure if it is interpretation or not, but maybe about the theory of the pi. Like,
Sure.
it's the 3.14 blah 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 blah. Like, because like, I think I've learned in, I don't know, one of my math class a long time ago, like, in wherever the diameter or something's wrong with my math.
The diameter
There's no
of the
math
circle.
teachers here, so nobody's going to tell you you're wrong.
Yeah.
The formula, like, they can make.
Yeah, so
I don't know which one. Okay, circumference, whatever it is, but they use like some of them and using the formula like reverse to find the pi, like, because somebody must have figured out what is pi, the value of pi, like 3.14 something.
Mm-hmm.
But like, there was a justification, like, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the questions I had when it comes to math was whether you need to be an expert in math to come up with some kind of high-level interpretation, or does an interpretation of math involve some kind of segue between math and another area of knowledge? Because math by itself, obviously, is very abstract and not particularly practical until you apply it to something. So, for instance, is interpreting a measurement into the real world, is that a version of kind of interpreting math, or is that not an interpretation? I guess my original question is very similar to yours, Razan. What does an interpretation of math look like?
Exactly. I'm
Well,
still confused as well.
are all infinities equal?
Technically not.
Right. So example, like, like the distance from my fingers here, you could divide it infinite times in half, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you could do the same with this distance. So are those infinities different lengths or different amounts, or are they all equal? Things like that. There is debate in mathematics.
Yeah.
And I don't know if someone were to say, all infinities are equal. I don't know if that's a good interpretation or not. And the same with science, like especially you get into things like physics. Like, anyone here want to tell me if string theory is a good interpretation?
What's the string theory?
Exactly. Right. So I think that actually, to go back to my point, I actually think that art is the easiest one for me to say, is it a good or bad interpretation? Because again, to Ms. Wagright's point, I just have to look at one way of knowing, reason. Are you justifying what you say in a logical way?
Right.
Well, it's a good interpretation. You know, I can end it there.
Yeah.
But when looking at like art, like I'm not sure about math. It looks like when you're looking from outside that it's harder to be biased when you're looking at math. Science, I think you can be, but like maybe it's harder than being biased towards art. So wouldn't that like influence if your interpretation of something is good or bad?
Well, I'm going to push back on that too, because I actually think that we misuse that word bias all the time. And I think even the way we set up math is biased to an extent. Like everything we do as humans comes from a human perspective. So, for example, why do we do math in sets of 10 and not sets of 8?
I thought about this.
Or
before.
sets of
Yeah.
13, right? Because we get 10 fingers, and that's natural to us, and so that we count that way, and we've developed a whole system. We've developed a whole system of mathematics around our bias and our perspective. So I mean, you can escape bias, and I think to say that really this is an unbiased thing is to not recognize just how biased everything in our perspective really is.
And also also how does the metric system is created? Like, one foot. Whose foot are we?
That's not the
measuring?
metric system. The
Okay. Oh no! Just kidding.
Imperial.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the world, not the United States.
That's imperial. Metric system is what everyone else does.
All right.
It's the one that makes sense within our perspective.
Yeah. So okay, density is the foot to meter. Okay, meter. Like, who determines what is 1 meter? Like 1 centimeter. Like, we know it's like around like this much, or like I don't know, something like this. But like who determines this? Is this also biased, right? So whoever what do you call it, decides how much is 1 centimeter is also biased. Like,
Yeah, I believe that the centimeters, meters has to do with the circumference of the Earth, to bring that full circle, by the part of the pun. But I don't know for sure, but I do know, like, for example, Celsius, right? Like, the freezing is 0, right? And where water freezes, and where water boils is 100, and everything is between. But the fact that we chose water freezing and water boiling, again, is a human perspective on something we see as natural.
I think it's also
you can't escape bias.
efficiency as well. Like, as you
From
said
our
before,
perspective.
That's true.
Right.
Like as you said before, the circumference of the Earth. That's how we create the metric system. That's a potential.
The length measurement, I think, comes down to that at some point.
So it's probably the most of, like, we maybe a long time ago people like find the most efficient way to create this metric system, and like also the Celsius, like, because 0 and 100 is easier to memorize. Like, come on, what is Fahrenheit, right? Like 32 degrees. What is this?
We're a little off topic. I had to get on my soapbox a second, because this bias is the most misused word in any TOK essay I've ever read, and I think that we're a bit off topic to say that bad interpretations can exist in science when they're biased, and when they're good when they're unbiased, because there's no such thing.
But why wouldn't history be considered harder than, for instance, art? Since mainly, like, of course, considering that everything is biased, so bias not a criteria anymore, and should judge, I would say, history or art.
You can be more and less biased, so it can still be a criteria.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
But so in order to judge history or maybe art, you don't need to have that higher knowledge of the subject as should talk about math.
Well, for me, again, I was going back to what Mr. Leesnoda said, like, where maybe history is a little more close to art than something like human science or natural science, and it's maybe kind of a spectrum in this sense, if you will, where art is like, if you can justify it textually for Miss Wegbright, it's a good interpretation in her class, right?
But
History,
that's not how every English teacher
me too, when I
teaches,
taught
right?
English,
Yeah.
exactly the same thing. history, it has a bit of that too. You have to interpret it logically, but you're a bit more constrained in your textual support and what can be reliable and so on. You have to be a bit more constrained to what you've chosen as a topic and its significance to other people and what is a reliable source in that case, and then how you're interpreting that source. But it's still very much based on reason and justification. And then I think you get a bit more difficult to determine what's good and bad as you move up that spectrum.
Yeah, I think when I said difficulty earlier, I was thinking about it in kind of the opposite way that you're talking about, and I think your point makes a great deal of sense. But I was thinking in terms of the objectivity versus the subjectivity of the subject matter. So for instance, in natural science, we have this very objective idea of what is right and wrong, and not everyone can do it, but a scientist has a much clearer idea of what a good interpretation or a bad interpretation is, and there's kind of only one or two, as opposed to they kind of multiply the further you go down that subjectivity spectrum.
Yeah.
So I guess perhaps easy and difficult wasn't the right word to use.
But yeah.
Perhaps more rigid the further you go towards the objective AOKs and more loose the further you go to the subjective ones.
Mm-hmm.
We're about 50 minutes in now. We don't have a very large audience today, but I was curious to see if we had any questions from our small peanut gallery over here.
Is the gallery small or are they small?
They're not all small.
Actually, let me try to formulate this.
I'll give you guys a second before they ask questions. Thank you everyone for coming, by the way. I think we did a great, we're gonna give ourselves a round of applause. We're doing a great job. Yeah, cool. Questions?
Okay, give me 1 second.
Does anyone on the panel have a question they want to pose?
Like when you guys are discussing whether translation is a form of interpretation, and a good or bad translation is based on the interpretation of the translator on the text itself. So does that sort of imply that you need a good interpretation, which is very it's very loose, since you only need justification in arts to create a good translation.
I think more than maybe some other terms of interpretation, translation needs to rely a lot on consensus in terms to determine its accuracy. So if there was a word that was really particular to me because my grandma used it growing up wrong, and I translated it to that, and someone said, well, why'd you translate that word like that? No one else knows what that means.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my grandma does, right? That's not a good translation in that case because it's not reaching enough people. There's no consensus that that's what that word means. So I think it's particularly with translation in words, you have to go with what everyone understands it to mean, or otherwise the words don't mean anything.
That sort of shifts the translation to interpretation more in the more rigid and this more objective AOKs rather than in the arts where it's a bit more loose.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, I think too it's interesting to think about how translation can itself be an art form, in the sense where if you were to just put something into Google Translate, you wouldn't be able to actually understand what it means.
None
right?
of our students do that.
Yeah, right. And that comes across very, very clearly if something is just put into Google Translate without someone having read it over in the new language that they attempted to translate it into, because of all of the nuance and the connotations of the words themselves, right? And also all of the cultural differences, right? That also come into play when you are translating. I think that's definitely something, I think of manga, right? Or anime, the dubbed versus the subbed, right? Which one's better? And how do you really decide that when
I think it's a great point because
Yeah,
I
no,
think you could probably make an argument for both, right?
Right,
You could say,
absolutely.
Like, you could say I prefer the sub ones because I want to see the actual thing rather than me reading it.
Yeah.
Even though I know that's not as good in some ways.
But then you're also interpreting the visuals as much as you're interpreting
Right,
the
yeah.
actual, yeah.
And then even the subs, they can have like subs in different languages have like,
Yeah.
different interpretation on all the original meaning. Cause like let's say when I watch anime, I watch with Chinese subtitle. Cause and like names in Japanese actually make sense. Like the meaning, the characters to it, like it can be translated into Chinese, but like whereas like in English, they translate the pronunciation of the name.
Interesting.
So like there's different interpretation
Yeah.
inside the interpretation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that too, to make Ms. McBride's point earlier, the audience is significant too, right? So there might be something cultural that wouldn't be appropriate to show to a Filipino audience, so they change the translation, right? So to make it more palatable, because ultimately they want people to watch the show, whereas the translation might be different in English because they want some other kind of cultural nuance there too. Sorry.
I was going to ask, like, or bring up that I think that a question that I'd like to ask the panel is about, like, it seems like all of our, like, ultimately the question is a how question, like, how can we do this? And we basically said, most of the panel, not the whole panel, the way we do this is through reason, the way of knowing of reason, where we look at the methodology, we look logically at the evidence that supports the interpretation, and we go. I just want to know, are there other ways of knowing in the TOK spectrum that allow for us to determine good and bad interpretations through our intuition, or through our faith, or through our, the other, AOKs? Or is it really a reason thing, like a logic justification thing?
I think like it's mostly reason, like particularly in like arts, but then based on like faith, based on like how you were brought up, you interpret already stuff differently from how you may interpret it like with a set group of people. So I also think that plays a part.
Well, like with art though, could you say there's a good interpretation based on intuition or emotion? Like, someone can say, like, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like, and I like that because it makes me feel happy. I guess you're still bringing reason to the party here to explain it, yeah.
Because you're explaining your emotions. and
But then you're
how-
communicating your interpretation, you're not, but, yeah, anyway.
You have faith that your interpretation is accurate. So, yeah. I think there's a reason they don't emphasize the WAOKs as much anymore.
Yeah.
The ball spaghetti. Well, great. If there aren't any other questions, I think this is a good place to close out our 5th TOK talk of the 2022 IB grading period. I think I said that right. Thank you again for everyone for showing up, and thank you to our hopefully large audience on YouTube. Have a great rating session after you watch.